So Nick, we're going to talk about the cell image, and this is an interesting image because, you know, it relates to some of the shoots we talked about in previous interviews, but this is one where Lee used imagery to sort of, I guess, make people aware of his own feelings or express his own emotions. Just tell me a bit about the background for the shoot, how it came about.
It was I think Tina Brown was running a magazine called Talk, I think, at the time. It was a new magazine, and they wanted to do a big interview with Lee. I think he'd either just gone to Givenchy or just left Givenchy. I can't remember. It was around the Givenchy time, and she wanted to do a picture of him. And Lee said, "I want to," you know, and obviously he was not enjoying life as part of one of those big corporate fashion houses. And I think he wanted to do a sort of autobiographical picture, autobiographical or biographical picture expressing how he felt about the way the world was treating him, specifically about the way business was treating him. And I think it does. So he wanted to do a picture of himself in chains, hanging in a lunatic asylum, so hanging in a padded cell. And he did that sort of also, it wasn't just about he was in chains, he was suspended and the chains were hooked into his own flesh. And so he hung up by his own flesh in a sort of padded cell, was sort of how he was, which is actually a fairly, you know, sadly not awfully how Lee died. You know, one can take these images as bits of sort of whimsy, but actually it's a tragic sort of.
Were you worried about him at this point? Because
no. He seems such a robust character. You know, anybody says, "Oh, fuck off," you know, he was so kind of cross in how he would speak about things. You certainly didn't feel it was. You know, he just felt like he could. You know, there was never any sense, I don't think, that he was frightened of people, that he thought it was, you know, it was all too much for him. He seemed totally robust. He was like, he could take anybody on. It was his sort of how he reflected, how he didn't seem in any way sort of, you know, yes, he wanted to do his picture saying, I'm in a padded cell hanging by my own flesh, which is sort of...
It's a similar thing to what he did when he did the It's a Jungle Out There collection. It was, you know, express what he felt about the way the fashion industry treated people and him, and, you know, use his work as a vehicle for that.
So I think there was one can look at it back with the tragic circumstance that happened afterwards and see very worrying and very realistic signs of what he was actually going through. But he was so, when you met him, he was actually so sort of full of life and kind of full of anger in a bad way, but anger in a kind of, you know, as a force, the way I wanted to do things. I didn't feel that it was getting the better of him. He certainly felt he was getting the better of it, and he was going to take them all on. You know, art world, business world, fashion world, any world he would take on, and he would be who he was, and he would show that, you know, what he was. So this particular picture, which we had to recreate a padded cell, and we had to put something he could lie on, so as if he was appearing to be held by the chains. Wasn't the easiest of shoots because it's not very nice being put in chains and hanging there in a kind of hot padded cell. So it was a difficult shoot physically, and he didn't like it, and he didn't feel like he enjoyed being sort of, you know, restrained in that way. But I guess that was part of the, you know, what he was saying.
Did he like the final image?
Yes, I think so.
I
think so.
It must be a hard image in a way to look at now, because as you say, it's not, you know, it's different to the face cover that we discussed with the red eyes, because there's something very strong about that, whereas this one, there's a darkness to it.
There is a darkness to it, but those big fashion houses are difficult for designers. Designers are, as we said in other interviews we talked through, designers and artists, so let's call them all artists, it's easier, are super sensitive to their environment, and that's what people want from them. They want people who are sensitive to things that we are not sensitive to, so they are aware of bits of life that just miss us by, so they can create this vision that we go, oh, yes, that's, you know, that's how life could be, is, or, you know, so you need a sensitivity to the artist, but then they're expected to perform as if they have no sensitivity.
You have to switch it on and off.
People are fired around them, and relationships are broken, and pressure's put on them to create collection after collection. We've talked, I'm sure you all talk about it sort of all the time on the panels, and it must be the sort of regular dialogue of any fashion designer. But the pressure you're put under to produce things, which is absolutely inhuman. And then without the sort of sufficient, in my opinion, without the sufficient psychological or sort of, you know, about the care that needs to go into. If you're going to treat a person, I won't say a fragile person because that implies sort of wallflower, but somebody who is super sensitive to life very harshly, you're not going to get the best result. You need to be careful of these people. I don't, these people, it sounds awful, but you need to cherish artists.
But it's strange, isn't it? Because with someone like Lee McQueen, I think you never saw it in his work in terms of, like, obviously you saw the frustrations reflected in his work, but the work never tailed off. You know, that's the thing that everyone talks about with Plato's Atlantis, you know, which was obviously his final collection, is it was such a strong collection that seemed to suggest so many new ideas and so much kind of... And it must have been strange working alongside him when he was still producing work of such quality. Yeah,
and also, you know, the all thing, you know, of course, is, you know, you didn't know that he was suffering as much as he clearly was. You know, because he was such a robust individual and such a passionate and fiery individual. Yes, there was no reflection of that in a way that would make anybody that concerned. So difficult, and it's a difficult image now going back to it within, as I say, within that sort of framework of history now.
Let's talk more about the pragmatic side of that shoot, just because I find it interesting, because I do think you know, it's interesting in a similar way that Blade of Light is interesting in how you put it together. How did you do the hooks through the skin?
It's the hooks are it's the old trick of using pigskin again. So the hooks
big feature of your
work. Well, it was a big feature because, you know, it actually allows you to make very realistic cuts in pigskin and then put the graft, if you want, in photographically onto somebody's body, so it looks like they're very realistically cut. So, you know, we Simon Kenny, who's a fantastic set maker who makes lots of the sets for Lee's shows, constructed this padded cell with one door open, and then we sort of strung a sort of hammock, if you want, much smaller than Lee's body, on chains, and then wrapped Lee up in chains, and then put him on the hammock so he looks like the chains are actually the things that, and then we put bulldog clips on his face
to create the pulling
effect. And then we put bulldog clips and pulled them on wires, so that afterwards in post his skin would actually be being lifted or pulled into place, and then afterwards in post, after the shoot, I then got the side of pig, and put the hooks into that and pulled those in the same way, and then transferred the bits in post. So it's sort of, you know, I'm a house of horror tricks, but it is kind of it is the best way to do it.
And do you remember how people reacted to the image at the time?
No, it's funny, Luke. People, this is more, you know, the reason I started SHOWstudio is because, you know, working for a magazine like Talk or any of those big magazines, very hard to get any reaction at all, to be honest. People don't ring you up. You know, the letters page is non-existent. It was also made up by the editor normally. There was no feedback, and magazines felt very much that way, that you do your work, out it would go, comes out 3 months later when you've actually physically and mentally moved on to something else, and then it's a sort of tumbleweed going by. And I got very frustrated with that throughout the 90s. This sort of, you know, you feel you're pouring your heart into something and you perform it or you deliver it, and yet there's no reaction to it. The only reaction comes from being booked again the following season to do the campaign.
And it's not like you want applause or thanks, it's more that you want to know what people think.
Well, it's a human reaction to want to have some sort of, you know, feeling that you touched people, or that you know, there's some, I mean, yes, applause, yes, actually one does. You know, if you say, I'm speaking to a musician friend of mine who was saying he was railing against the old idea of everything's a light culture these days. But I was saying to him, but you won't stand up in front of an empty stadium, and you know, you want people clapping and singing along and clearly adoring you. You know, and as a photographer, that's not what you get. I mean, you want to have the love of your audience. I mean, one probably shouldn't want to have that, but you do. Just as a human being, you want somebody to say, well done, that was fantastic.
But also just to know how people interpreted it, you know, what they took from it, how it made them feel.
Because you are essentially creating a story, or creating an image which is full of story, and you want to know if some of that's got through and some people understand that, or whether it was you need to know whether your image is good or bad.
Well, that's kind of, it's a question I wanted to ask, and it really pertains to this. It's just, I felt like Lee used his shows to do that. He used them to provoke emotion, to provoke reaction, and you know, I think he was a very visceral person, and he used his, people responded to his shows in a very visceral way. And do you think he wanted Imagery to kind of do that similar thing as well? Or do you think he wanted to make people feel something, whether it was sickness or admiration for the clothes, or? Yes,
I think as a performer, and it could be Lee as a performer or me as a performer, one doesn't want to create an image, whether it's a show or a photograph, that has no effect. That would be the worst thing. Mediocrity, being ignored, it having no effect is so disappointing. One feels that one's trying to say something really important that's going to change the world. I mean, I don't have false pretensions to what I do, but I'm aware that when I'm trying to create images which are really going to change things. That are going to, it's something that will be really important because it's super important to me. And so yes, if you get no reaction to it, and the magazine system set up so you get no reaction to it, it is very frustrating. And I started working on some of the stories I'd worked with in sort of the 90s. I purposely engaged in themes that, to be honest, were themes I held very dear. So the lack of any model that was even slightly curvaceous on the catwalks, on the runways. The lack of any sort of ethnic minorities being represented properly. The fact that everything's focused on 18-year-old white girls. All that I found so abhorrent that I wanted to create imagery which dealt with that. And I also wanted to create imagery which had some reaction. So when I did some of the campaigns I did with Levi's campaigns where we used people in the 80s and 90s, or the story I did with Lee about the people who are of different physical shapes, those created a lot of public reaction. So once you've done a series of images like the Fashionable series, we're working with people like Amy Mullins who lost her legs from knee down, was amputated on her first birthday, or people who had severe curvature of the spine, or people who were blind, who have these incredibly different body shapes. And once we did that story, the reaction was so huge, all across the press, all across the world, in every magazines. I mean, for years, probably years, more than a year. Every day, Charlotte was getting a phone call from another magazine saying, "Can we please run this picture? We'd like to run it with an article." And it was on reference books and books in academia, and etc., etc. So you want to have that reaction, and that's just the same way as my musical friend, who was arguing against likes. And I said to him, "You wouldn't want to perform in front of an empty stadium. Some of us need, or not some of us, but we naturally need some sort of reaction to what we do."
It's interesting to think about it because I feel, and we've talked about it a few times in the way that history had kind of not rewritten Lee McQueen, but the things that are remembered about him and cited, and I do feel his shows are one of them. And I think he was brilliant at sort of creating fashion theatre. But I do think that notion of what he was trying to do with his shows, which was, I think it just boils down to making people think and making people react. I see it across all of his work, whether it's just in the individual pieces or in the imagery or even, as we talked about, in how he spoke and conducted himself. And I think that's one of the things that does come across the most in this is, that it's not just the shows where he wanted to provoke, it was everything. Yes,
I think it's a sense that probably everybody has of wanting to know why we're here. Why we're on this planet. What we exist for, and actually sort of marking your time is a very good way of knowing why you're here. I'm here for a reason, it's to do this. I'm important because I don't think one wants to feel important, like more important than other people. I think one wants to justify one's existence. It's the ageless question of why we're here.
So it's about capturing that. That's interesting. Thanks, Nick.
Totally.